What I decided to talk about this today is along with Dorothy Cashman, you see on screen there, there's myself and Dorothy Cashman, and we're receiving an award. This was only, actually, it was today week. It was that picture was taken, so this is very fresh and very up to date. Today week, we were down at the Convention Centre in Dublin, and we were at the Unpust Book Awards. We were shortlisted for two categories for the book that's on your left there. I kind of is it left or right on your screen, but as Irish food history, a companion. And this book basically is a 28 let me see is let me just see if I can uh move forward here. Oh, I just want to see that stop share. For some reason it's not moving forward there. Let me just see if I try and go again. You're sharing your screen. I'm going to share the screen. Choose. That's the screen. It's the try that. Yeah. Let's see. I'll try and share this. Let me just see now if I can share that. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so as I said, this book, Irish Food History, a Companion, it is a co-publication with EUt plus Academic Press. So as I say, I'm a lecturer, a senior lecturer in Technology University Dublin and Grange Corman, but the EUt plus Press is the European University of Technology's academic press. So it's a group of technological universities around Europe that came together and they have an academic press, which is basically about making stuff available open access. And in the chat there, I have put in a link because this book is available for free, open access, all around the world as such. And anyone who wishes to engage with it or have a look at it or even download chapters or download the whole thing, it's all there up there for you to do. So that's in the chat. You can access that and just copy it and save it yourselves at any stage. But as I said, it's a 28 chapter book, 800 pages. And it also between the different, there's six different sections that you see listed there. But in between the sections, we have poetry and sort of songs and a few recipes and stuff like that. But poetry from Raftery, Seamus Heaney, and Paula Meehan. And we'll get to a few of them a little later. But since the talk is, and I will talk you through the book and give you some of the key highlights of the book, but I wanted to give you a bit of background about sort of food history in Ireland and how we got to actually come to this stage where we have enough people who have done the research and who are, curious enough about Irish food history to be buying the book or to be, for publishers to be interested in publishing the book. And as I was saying that earlier on, that we have the book is nearly we published 2,000 copies of it, which is nearly sold out now, and we're hoping to publish more. You're probably after Christmas, but the fact that the book is available freely online as well, and I think it's been downloaded over 5,000 times so far, which is great. So I'll give you a bit of a background about, I don't know from, most of you would understand that Ireland actually does have a food history. Some of you may have visited the Ferry Carrig Folk Park down in just outside of Wexford town. You may have seen, some of the recreations there of sort of of some of the settlements of Neolithic people and stuff like that. Equally on the screen there, there's sort of there's an image there of shell middens, and those shell middens are basically the rubbish pits that our ancestors left behind them, and you'll see that they're full of sort of oyster shells and clam shells and limpets and all that sort of stuff. And it's interesting, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but Seamus Caulfield. I run a master's program in gastronomy and food studies in TU Dublin. And every January, I bring my students up to the Cage of Fields in Mayo. And Seamus Caulfield and his son, Declan, they look after us really well and bring us around the Cage of Fields and up in Belderrick, where it was Seamus Caulfield's father, who was the primary teacher up there, who discovered the Cage of Fields. And for those who are not familiar with the Cage of Fields are basically the oldest evidence of organized farming in Europe. Because what they are is that when they were cutting the bog, they noticed sort of a pattern of walls underneath the bog. And the fact that the bogs had been there for 5,000 years means that whatever's under the bog had to be at least 5,000 years old. And then when they tracked and they did the work, they figured out they excavated it and all that and the patterns of it. They figured out that these walls must have been for dairying, because if it was for beef cattle, you wouldn't need small fields. You just let them out, and then you only need with with beef cattle, effectively, you don't need, all they need is they need grass and they need water. But with dairy cattle, they need to be milked twice a day. So you need to have them nearby and all that sort of stuff and look after them more regularly. But Seamus Caulfield always spoke to our students and he always explained to them that we often talk about hunter gatherers. And he reckoned that our ancestors, our early ancestors in Ireland, weren't hunter gatherers, they were fisher gatherers because there was nothing to hunt. After the Ice Age, all the big animals had been wiped out. And we had to wait for the Neolithic farmers to come and to reintroduce some of the big animals into Ireland. So cattle and stuff like that would have been brought over by curragh or by some form of boat by those Neolithic farmers that came here later on. But these sort of shells that you see there, those shell middens, are evidence of those what we call fisher gatherers. You know what I mean? So, and equally, we're familiar. The other thing, you see there, layman Vrudon, which is one of the other passions I've had over the years, is researching food related place names. So there are a huge amount of food, thousands of food related place names all over the country, from say Cloan Mala, which is the meadow of honey, or Cloan Tarv, the meadow of the bull, and places like that. But up here you see on the screen it's layman Vrudon. And Layman Vrudon is one of the few, most, like nearly 90% of all the Irish place names are named, come from the Irish language. Whereas actually Layman Vrudon, or Leixlip, actually is one of the few that comes from Norse, or from the Vikings. And for anyone who's ever been up to IKEA and had their gravad lax, they'd realize that actually what gravad lax is that it's grave salmon. Lax is it's salmon in Norse as such. So lax lep means the leap of the salmon, or lame on Vrudon. And it's quite, anyone from Ireland, anyway, who's gone through the Irish schooling system will be familiar with the mythological tale of the salmon of knowledge, and how Finn McCool got his name. That he was working for them, or sorry, that his name was them, and he was working. He was sort of an apprentice under Finnegas, the poet, who had heard about this amazing magical salmon that was in the River Boyne, that had got all its wisdom from eating hazelnuts. And the story was that whoever would taste the salmon first, would get all wisdom. And naturally, it was the poet who was expecting to taste it, but as his young apprentice was roasting the fish, there was a blister came up on the fish, and he burst the blister with his thumb, hoping that in case it would burn. And when he did, he burnt his thumb, and he sucked his thumb just because the pain of the thumb, and he inadvertently then became the first person to taste the fish, and hence he got all the wisdom, and hence he changed. His name was changed from Dem to Fionn, and Fionn meaning wisdom, or bright one, and his father was cool, so he was Finn McCool. And of course, we see here, if anyone's from Dublin or been to Dublin or familiar with Dublin, there's a great the statue there of Molly Malone. And Molly Malone was a fishmonger, and I suppose Dublin's national anthem, you could say, or Dublin's city anthem is, about for Molly Malone. But the chorus goes, she wheeled her wheelbarrow through streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels alive, alive, oh. So we can see, that actually shellfish being sold on the streets of Dublin is nothing new. And I'll show you some images later on from from the 17th century, which proves that, or actually the 18th century, of the 1760s, which shows images from the streets. And so equally, this book effectively brings you on a journey of over 2,000 years. Actually, it goes back, believe it or not, 35,000 years. But effectively, we think about this, that only recently, there's an image up there in the corner about a group of archaeologists from UCD, led by Muriel McClatchy. And this is only 2.5 weeks ago or so, they discovered a 2,000-year-old fig that was buried up in North County Dublin, on the coast of North County Dublin. And what this proves is stuff that we basically believed for a long time, but it proves it now, because you need evidence, you know what I mean, and that. But it shows that there had been trade from North County Dublin, from this settlement in North County Dublin. They were trading with Roman Britain. at that time. So it's curious there, of all the images up on the screen at the moment, probably the oldest, even though there's a 2,000-year-old fig, the oldest must be the oyster, because you can see those oyster shells that you see, and oysters go back as long as there's been people in Ireland. They've been eating oysters. Uh, we have the 2,000-year-old fig. Naturally, next would come probably the bacon and cabbage, since particularly the potato was with the bacon and cabbage, and the potato didn't come here till 400 years ago or so, over from Peru. And then we have fish and chips there, which come probably at the end of the 19th century with the Italians. Again, they were influenced by Jewish settlers in London, particularly, who set up sort of fish shops over there. But it was the Italians who did it here. Next would come probably the jumbo breakfast roll. You see Pat Short there with his jumbo breakfast roll, which was a big thing during the Celtic Tiger. And I suppose last but by no means least is the Irish spice bag, you know. And what's interesting about the Irish spice bag, this is something that's probably only 10 years old, but it's actually traveling, because I have a daughter over in Australia at the moment, and she brought a Chinese friend who's working with her in Australia to sample a Irish spice bag in Sydney, Australia, which you said it cost a fortune, you know. So these things are traveling. And naturally we have, coddle. If you're from Dublin, you have the cockles and crisps. So, food basically comes from the most ancient and early time up to the present day. So what I'm going to do is, before I go through, talking through each section of the book and bringing you on that journey, I want to talk a bit about my own positionality, my own background, my training as a chef in Cahill Brewer Street, and then later becoming a teacher there, my attendance at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery for the last 25 years or so, where I really started to sort of start to research Irish food history and learn about food history from all over the world. I finished my PhD in 2009. I set up, along with a number of colleagues, the Dublin Gastronomy Symposium in 2012. And Brendan Dunford was one of our keynote speakers there this year, gave a wonderful talk at the DGS, the Dublin Gastronomy Symposium, in May this year. Again, Dorothy Cashman, who is my co-editor on this book, she was the first PhD student that I brought to completion. I've brought seven. No, I've brought eight to this stage, and there are 10 at the moment working away. So it's great. I'm getting paid to learn. And again, COVID-19 happened, and we got this idea. I suppose a lot of people, we were actually, I'm having sort of deja vu, being back in this bedroom here, sort of thing, on a Zoom call back to COVID. That was when we got the idea to sort of, I rang Dorothy up and said, listen, would you be interested in working with us on this project? And thankfully she was. And we went on that journey together. But in many ways, we would be nowhere without our parents, and we're huge. Parents are quite often a huge influence on us. And my late father, who died 5 years ago, has been a huge influence on my life. It's interesting. There's a saying in the Irish language that says "Brishan and duchas trihula on chuits," basically, that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or literally it means that, that the nature comes out through the eyes of a cat. Like what else would a cat do but chase a mouse, sort of thing. But my father started off as a primary teacher, and then he started reading the news when RTE started, and used to do that part time while he was still a primary teacher. And then he got into journalism full time, and then he got a job in the university, and he was a biographer, and he was a collector of folklore and songs, and he was also an author. And in many ways, I went completely the other way, because I became a chef, and there was no tradition of chefs in my family. There was traditions of teachers and journalism and all that sort of stuff, but not chefing. But I became a chef. But within a number of years, I found myself as a teacher, as a broadcaster, a food historian, a singer, and a folklore collector. Do you know what I mean? So it's interesting how, no matter how far you tend to break away from maybe your family values or traditions or stuff like that, you find yourself, that they actually have a huge influence on you. Again, as I said, I set up the Masters in Gastronomy and Food Studies in 2017. In 2018, I presented an 8-part TV program called Blosta which was sort of a public history project launched by T.G. Carr and the Irish Folklore Commission to collect and preserve recipes, ephemera, material culture, and stories from the Irish public. Like, we went around 8 different locations around Ireland, and actually was the most beautiful summer, they filmed in the months of May and June, and the weather was just stunning. Ireland never looked so well. And in 2021, again during lockdown as well, I guest edited a special issue of Folklife Journal on Irish Foodways. That it's available open access as well, so you can just go into Folklife, journal, and for that year 2021, and that special issue is available open access, which is wonderful. Um, so going back to, suppose, where a lot of it began, I went to Cal. I suppose I when I finished school, I went to I was offered a position in Cahill Brewer Street, but I was equally offered First Arts in UCD. And at the time, my father was a teacher in UCD, and at the time there was free fees for children, and there were 6 of us. I suppose one of the reasons my father probably took the job there was trying to educate his family to third level and all. And here was the eldest son sort of turning his nose up at it. So anyway, he convinced me to give it a year and see what I see how I liked it. And I stayed there for a year. I should I say I stayed there long enough maybe to get a J1 visa and to go off to America. And I went off traveling for a few years. And I suppose the university of life. I traveled a lot. I worked in London. I worked in America for 2 summers. I traveled all through Europe and North Africa and places like that. But anyway, after a number of years, I came back to college to do my chef's apprenticeship in DIT, as it was in Cahill Brewer Street. You see it on the screen there. We're no longer there. We were there for since 1941, but we left just during COVID, and we moved up to Grangegorman to the new TU Dublin campus. But I was highly influenced there by people like Joe Hegarty and Liz Roth there, who were in the pictures. And equally, there's an old chef there. He's butchering a chicken or something like that. Uh, but he was a really interesting fella, a fella called PJ Dunn. And the thing about PJ is PJ must have been in his early 70s. And he had worked in the famous restaurant called Jamais, a famous French restaurant which opened in 1901 and closed in 1967. And once, like for a long, long time during the 20th century, it was considered to be one of the best restaurants in the world. Now, that's not a story that people hear about Ireland or Dublin. That actually it had one, actually it had two of the best restaurants in the world from the 1950s to the 1970s or so, which was things people don't necessarily know about. But he had these wonderful stories that during the years of the emergency, so the emergency is what we in Ireland call the years of the Second World War, because we had the emergency acts, it was called the emergency legislation, but we were neutral. But he described that in Jamais, he was the larder chef. And all the other restaurants had very little seafood available because German U-boats would have been going around the waters around Ireland and stuff like that, and trawlers wouldn't be going out as much. But he had figured out he was able to get monkfish. Now, we're all familiar with monkfish at the moment, because it's quite popular. But at that time, monkfish was used to bait lobster pots. No one had any respect for monkfish because if anyone knows monkfish, it's got the most ugly face. Like, it's unbelievable, mad, crazy teeth on it, horrible big face. And actually interesting, if anyone remembers when Queen Elizabeth II came to visit the English market in 2011, and she visited the English market in Cork, and there was a great picture of her breaking her sides laughing with the fishmonger down there. And the reason that what the joke he told her to get her laughing is he explained that they called monkfish mother-in-law fish, and that's what caused her to break into that smile. You know what I mean? But anyway, he explained that this monkfish, he was able to cut little wedges in certain ways with the monkfish and put it through flour, egg, and breadcrumbs, and used to sell it as scampi. And in another way, he used to do it and put some sort of a bisque sauce with it, and he'd sell it as collops of lobster. The idea was that the monkfish meat is quite robust and can stand up to lots of different ways, and you could nearly fool people. It was something that it wasn't. And I arrived back after traveling for a few more years. When I left college, I came back to do advanced courses in college, and I realized that PJ had died and nobody had recorded his stories. So I sort of took it on myself later on. There was these 2 other chefs here as well, Liam Kavanagh and Bill Ryan, and both of those were had worked on the great big ocean liners, like the Cunard, not as I say, not the Titanic, they're not that old, and anyway, if they had, they would have gone down with it. But similar types of ocean liners from the White Star Line and the Cunard lines, and they would have traveled all over the world. This is before aviation took off in the 50s, and these are the millionaires of the world used to travel around in these luxury big cruise liners as such, and they used to prepare ice sculptures, hors d'oeuvre banquets, with caviar and all this sort of stuff. But they had wonderful stories as well. So I took it on myself, influenced by my father and the research he used to do with old people collecting folklore and songs. I decided I would do an oral history. And that's really, I ended up in 2009. I completed my PhD on an oral history of Dublin restaurants. Now, as I said, my father was always interested in songs and seannos, singing. Particularly, my father was from Connemara in the west coast of Ireland, from Galway, West Galway. But and again, was brought up with the Irish language. Even though we were brought up in Dublin, we were brought up with the Irish language as our first language, and we went to Irish language schools and we learned the seannos, and we used to perform at feshes and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, we were in the Hughes's pub. This is around 1995. And there's a festival that still happens every year called Seannos Cuislife, which is a festival of seannos, unaccompanied singing, in Dublin. And it was Sunday afternoon, and we were in the back of Hughes's pub, and I heard one of the Goleen singers sing a song called the Irish Jubilee. And straight away, I knew I had to learn that song because there was so much food references in the song. For example, and basically the song itself was about an Irish American. It was based in 1860s about an Irish American who had been elected to the Senate, and he was so delighted with being elected that he was going to have a big party, big banquet for everyone who voted for him. And there was going to be the best of food and the best of songs and entertainment and the whole lot. But like it had these great rich food lyrics that some of you see on the line on the thing there. Like it says, "Oh, we ate oatmeal till we could hardly stir about. There was ketchup and hurry up, sweet kraut and sauerkraut. There was beefsteaks and mistakes down upon the bill of fare, roast ribs, spare ribs, and ribs that we couldn't spare." And even, there was reindeer and snow deer, dear me, and antelope, and the women had so much melon, the men said they can't elope. So you can see, like, I realized that I was like a magpie, that anything to do with food, whether it was poetry, whether it was songs, whether it was place names, whether it was novels or films or whatever, I was all over it and trying to actually pull any information and any data I could have about Irish food history from any source possible. And over the next 5 or 6 or 7 years, through my attendance, my annual attendance at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, each year there would be a new theme. And I took these themes as sort of an inspiration that every year I would try and carry out a new piece of research. So, for example, there was wild food there. I wrote a piece for that year about the history of seafood in Irish cuisine and culture, history of eggs in Irish cuisine and culture. There was, the fat of the land. I did the history of the pig in Irish cuisine and culture. Cured, fermented, and smoked food. We did a history of myself and Pádraig Gallagher. We did a history of corned beef in Ireland, etc. Etc. The history of the potato in the one on vegetables. So bit by bit, I was building up a better knowledge, a good understanding of the history of Irish food. And also, I was meeting like-minded people. Like, it was over at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery that I met Dorothy Cashman, my co-editor on this book. And again, I supervised her PhD, and actually Tara McConnell, her PhD as well, and John Mulcahy and a few other people who've gone on to do great research on Irish food over the years. Um, in the 2011, I met Eamon Maher and Brian Murphy from IT Tala, which is now part of TU Dublin, but it was separate to DIT at the time. And we got on well, and we decided to set up the Dublin Gastronomy Symposium again with Dorothy and Tara and a few other people. And that led to a publication in 2014 called Tickling the Palate, Irish Literature and Gastronomy. And it was the first you could say that it was the first major book published about Irish food within Irish literature or Irish culture. And it was a proper marker. And you can see now that the Dublin Gastronomy Symposium, it happens every 2 years and it's been gaining traction. Like we've had over 363 papers in the last since it started that have been downloaded nearly 150,000 times from all over the world, which is brilliant. So it's putting Ireland on the map. So I'd like to read you out this poem because this poem here is that we started the book with this poem. And this poem is it's a recent poem from her latest collection by Paula Meehan. Paula Meehan's the most amazing Dublin poet. And it's called The Solace of Artemis. So for those who are not familiar with Artemis, that the word art, like, Arthur means bear. All right, so Artemis is bear. So I read that every polar bear alive today has mitochondrial DNA from a common mother, Irish brown bear who once roved out across the last ice age. And I am comforted. It has been a long, hot morning with the children of the machine. Their talk of memory, of buying it cheap. But I, memory maker by trade, scan time coded in the golden hive mind of eternity. I burn my books. I burn my whole archive. A blaze that sears, synapses flaring cell to cell, where memory sleeps in the wax hexagonals of my doomed and melting comb. I see him loping towards me across the vast ice field, to where I wait in the cave mouth, dreaming my cubs about the den, my honeyed ones, smelling of snow and sweet oblivion. So the reason we put that poem in at the beginning is that in this first section of the book, which discusses the prehistory and archaeology of food in Ireland, in the first chapter, Food in Irish Prehistory, by J.P. Mallory, he explains new information that only came out in the last 10 years about that evidence of reindeer bone that were found down in Castlepook Cave in Cork with butchery marks on them that have been radiocarbon dated to 33,000 years BC. And equally, up in the Alice and Gwendolyn caves in the Burren, there are bones of a brown bear with butchery marks, the patella of a brown bear with butchery marks on it from around 12,500 years ago. And it made perfect sense. I think, Paula had heard of the brown bear in the Burren. I think that's what inspired her to write that poem. But it fitted in beautifully because up until up until Mallory provided the chapter for the book, I had always believed, like many people probably, that our ancestors only went back around 10,000 years, which is 8,000 BC as such. But it's amazing, this new evidence, and there's new evidence appearing all the time, as I explained, with the and I see a picture of it up there about the prune, or not the prune, the figs from 2,000 years ago. Again, there's chapters here from about, Finbar McCormick is a chapter about called The Lovely Bones, about the osteoarchaeological evidence of animal produce in Ireland. So osteoarchaeology is a speciality within archaeology where they can focus just on the bones, and they can tell from the type of bones and from the makeup of the bones where in Ireland the animal was feeding before it died. So, for example, there was evidence of bones of around 100 different pigs from a big banquet held up around County Meath. And by analysing the different bones, they were able to tell a story that the various people who came to that banquet would have come from different parts of Ireland and brought pigs with them to the feast, and then the pigs would have been killed at the feast. You know what I mean? So it's amazing the new knowledge that the new sort of scientific techniques that archaeologists have. For example, we talk here, the next chapter there is a landscape fossilized cage of fields, dairy farming and food production in the Irish Neolithic. And that title, A Landscape Fossilized, comes from a Seamus Heaney poem, because Seamus Heaney in around 1973 went to visit the cage of fields, went to visit Seamus Caulfield and his father. And, as Seamus Heaney often did, a week later, he sent him a letter in the post, and in the letter was a beautiful poem called Belderic. And, he described it as a landscape fossilized, all these quern stones and all these amazing stuff found. But what I mentioned earlier on about Seamus Caulfield, like what they figured out there, Seamus, when he discovered the cage fields around 50 years ago, he figured it out. It must have been dairy farming that was happening there because of the fields, because of the field system, that it must have been dairy farming. And he found a small sherd of pottery. And but it was only literally in the last 10 years that the technology came, that the science caught up, and they were able to actually do scrapings of the inside of that piece of pottery and catch some lipids and do analysis on those lipids. And it came out that they were animal fat, and not just that, but they were dairy fat. So that it had been milk that had been stored in that vessel. So quite often, the ideas people had, technology takes time later on to be able to reinforce that. But and again, finally, there's a chapter there by Nicola Gilligan about all the plant food that was eaten and the different, wild vegetables and fruits and nuts and all that sort of stuff that are found. So I put in some poetry here. Like there's a poem here I was familiar with, and I have it in the book, which is from Maribon to Gourde. Now, for those of you who were up in County Clare at the moment, just outside of Kinvara, there is a famous castle there, Dún Gourde. And there's a great story there about, so Gourde was the king, and actually his I think it's his brother or his cousin or something like that was a monk called Maribon, and he lived up in the Burren, sort of living an ascetic life. But there's a great story about Boher and Aeneas, where one Easter, I think it was one Easter Sunday, where they're about to sit down to this amazing banquet in Dún Goide, when at the same time up in the Burren you have the monk and his servant, and they've nothing to eat. And the servant saying, "Wow, wouldn't it be lovely to have something to eat?" And the monk says he asks God to send him a message. And as he does, what happens is these dishes magically, just as they're being put down at the banquet in Dungura, they magically rise up themselves and they go out the window and they float like a magic carpet over the Burren. And the King Gourd and all his retinue follow them on their horses, and they actually land just down in front of the ascetic monk, up in the Burren, and anyway. But anyway, this it says, "To what meals the woods invite me all about. There are water, herbs, and cresses, salmon, trout. A clutch of eggs, sweet mast, and honey are my meat. Heath breeze and whortleberries for a sweet. All that one could ask for comfort round me grows. There are hips and haws and strawberries, nuts and sloes. And when summer spreads its mantle, what a sight! Marjoram and leeks and pignuts, juicy bright." And when you think about it, all of those ingredients, this is from the 8th century. All of those ingredients are still available in Ireland today. There's no talk about potatoes there. Potatoes didn't come to the 16th century, at the end of the 16th century, etc. And just to give you a small piece of just to give you a small piece of the poem that Seamus Heaney wrote, having visited Belderrick, he says, and he's talking here about quernstones. Quernstones is what we use to actually grind flour, as such, to grind barley or to grind wheat and to make flour out of it. So you can have either rotary querns or you can have saddle querns. And Seamus Caulfield himself actually did his PhD on those quernstones. But anyway, he says they just kept turning up and were thought of as foreign, one-eyed and benign. They lie about his house, quernstones out of a bog, to lift the lid of the peat and find this pupil dreaming of Neolithic wheat. When he stripped off blanket bog, the soft piled centuries fell open like a glib. There were the first plough marks, the Stone Age fields, the tomb, corbelled, turfed, and chambered, floored with dry turf coombe, a landscape fossilized, its stone walls patterning, repeated before our eyes in the stone walls of Mayo. The second section brings us through medieval Ireland, and it starts off with the history of bog butter in Ireland. Now, I mentioned that cattle, the fact that it was dairy farming happening up in the Cage of Fields. Seamus Caulfield explains that within that, even if a number of settlers came, maybe even in two curraghs, and maybe brought around four animals with them, maybe one cow in calf and one other cow and one other bull, that within a period of 20 years, they could have had over 100 cattle, and within a period of 50 years, they could have had 1,000 or more, cattle. So it's amazing how quickly things can spread. And actually, today in Ireland, we have more cattle than we have people. We have something, I think it's 8.6 million cows in Ireland. Uh, so we're clearly in love with the cow. A bit too much, maybe one could say at the time, but everything to do with our love affair with the cow is again hidden in plain sight, in so much that the Irish word for a road, a bowher, comes from the word cow, bow. A bowher had to be big enough that two cows could pass each other on it. Otherwise, it would be deemed a cuss-on or a footpath. Equally, the word for a boy in the Irish language, buachel, actually means cow herder. And Colleen, which is the girl, comes from that quill in Colleen. It's the same quill as in Buachil, which basically a Colleen is basically a little herder. All right. So cattle have been so important. And what's interesting as well is that we were more interested in the cattle for their milk and for what we call white meats, as in all the different foods, milk, dairy-based foods. These were fermented foods. These were forms of cheeses, from the softest cheese to a middle soft cheese to a middle hard cheese to a rock hard cheese, uh, and all sorts of whey and butter and buttermilk and all of these things. That's really what so much of our ancestors lived on, alongside gruels and oat cakes and stuff like that. Now, naturally, bees, and there's a lovely chapter there on beekeeping from Shane Lahan, and honey came in, and bees. This beautiful image there is from a church window, stained glass church window based on St. Gubnut. And some of the saints are linked with the bees. St. Gubnut down in Ballyvourney is linked with the bees, and St. Madamog is said to have brought the bees over from Wales originally. Catherine Sims has a wonderful chapter about sort of banqueting in the medieval Gaelic chiefs, and there's a picture in the book, and it shows actually that at these banquets we had actual professional farters. Right. So that there was these entertainers before Netflix, there was these entertainers who could actually musically toot or fart or whatever, as entertainment, as part of the tradition. And again, we have poets and musicians and harpists and all that sort of stuff. And again, there's a chapter equally on Irish diet in the 11th century, as reflected in the satire Aisling Mac Con Iomaire, which is this most wonderful tale that we both don't have time to talk about now, but you tuck in and have a look yourself online at your own leisure. I've put this recipe up there because this is a recipe that I found in a cookbook that was published in Liège, up Belgium, or near Holland, there in 1604, by a chef called Lancelot de Casteau. Now, this, you're wondering, why would this chef have a recipe called leg of mutton roasted the Irish way? But the thing is that this chef had actually worked for a number of bishops on the continent who were originally from Ireland, Irish bishops who were the strong European tradition. And I think when you look at the recipe, it's very interesting because it shows the sophistication of it. So it says, take your leg of mutton and batten it well without breaking the skin. Then marinate it in vinegar for 3 or 4 hours. After taking it out and drying with a cloth, stud it with cloves of garlic and finger-length pieces of cinnamon. Sprinkle with sage and marjoram and spit roast it, continuously basting with butter and Spanish wine. When well cooked, cut 2 lemons into little wedges and put into the pan juices with a little vinegar and serve. Now, one of my students from years ago, it now has two restaurants in Dublin, and he features on that program, the restaurant, a fellow called Stephen McAllister. And I remember he recreated this dish for us a number of years ago for my students, and it was beautiful, really, really beautiful. So it's quite like it seems actually quite modern. And this is from, 1604, which means that they would have been cooking and eating in this sort of style at least by 1550. The next chapter talks about early modern Ireland. And actually, Fionnán O'Connor, the picture of him down there, has a chapter about sort of Uisce Beatha and feudal Irish hospitality and medicine. And it's fascinating because the story that's been peddled for so long about the history of whiskey in Ireland was that the monks brought it to Ireland and, brought that idea of distilling. Whereas Fionnán is doing his PhD at the moment, nearly finished. And he has found that there's absolutely no evidence of monks making whiskey or being the original originators of bringing distilling skills to Ireland. That Irish, the old Irish Gaelic families, that we had medical families, the O'Doon Leva amongst one of them, which were traditional medical families, and they would have learned the art of distilling through from the Arabs and through the universities of Salerno, Montpellier, and Bologna. In the in the Middle Ages, and would have brought that knowledge and would have actually translated those books from Latin and Greek into the Irish language with this knowledge. And again, linked in with the monks would have been there's a great chapter there from John McCafferty about sort of Franciscans and the power of fish. They had very they got special dispensation from Isabella to bring their fish into the Louvain without paying any taxes on them. Toby Barnard has a wonderful chapter around food in the 18th century, and he draws on one particular source that is amazing. And I mentioned it earlier on, and I'll show you some images now about a fellow called Hugh Douglas Hamilton, which was an artist who drew a thing called the Cries of Dublin, where he actually captured the images of people selling food on the streets of Dublin in 1760, and I'll show you some of those. Again, Daniel Clark has a chapter about food receipts from Bird Castle, which is the oldest receipt book, and again, it's unbroken over 300 years down in Offaly. And again, Tara McConnell has one of the chapters about food and dining within the correspondence of Jonathan Swift. So let's have a look at some of these images from 1760 from Hugh Douglas Hamilton. All of these images are drawn from the streets of Dublin. These are like there's a fisher boy, there's someone selling fresh and pickled herrings, someone else selling gingerbread and apples, someone else saying oysters. So you can see the oyster theme is carrying all the way through. Tripe, gentlemen, please, and new milk being sold there from a horse and cart in the streets of Dublin. But equally, there's a green stall at the root market, and then there's a scalding match at the fish market. And I've just put some images up there from Moore Street from around 20 years ago. And to show that actually things haven't really changed all that much from the 1760s up until the 2010s or so. Moving on, there's two final sections, and we can answer any questions you have. The next section talks about sort of developments in food supply, technology, and trade. Again, Grace Neville has a wonderful chapter about food within the correspondence of Daniel O'Connell, and he was a great gourmand, loved his food, loved his wine, but he was also very caring for his people down in Cahersiveen, and he made sure that when there was various diseases going on. I think the cholera had come to Cahersiveen at one stage. He made sure that his family killed a number of cattle and made fresh meat available for his neighbours and stuff like that. John Mulcahy has this wonderful chapter about eating abroad and remembering home, about food parcels and how when the trains and steamships arrived, that the postal system got very sophisticated, and literally you could kill a turkey or a duck in Dublin or in Cork or in Clare and put a tag on it with the name of somewhere in England, and within 18 hours they would have it. You know what I mean? That it was so sophisticated. And then the last two chapters there are about butter making. And again, we were saying here, there's a picture there of a churn, and there was different shapes and different sizes of churns all over the country. You could nearly put a line between the northern half of Ireland, where they actually churned full milk, as in whole milk, whereas in the southern half of Ireland, they used to actually set the milk, as in put the milk in low, broad containers so that the cream would rise to the top, and then they'd scoop the cream off and then make the butter with the cream in the churn. Whereas in the northern half, they just gather a whole milk and churn it whole. But the big change came, and this is in this chapter 17 there, a dairy democracy, the cooperative movement. So this amazing sort of technological advance happened around the 1890s, where in Denmark they discovered the centrifugal cream separator. So it was this device that you could put fresh milk into it and spin it around so that actually it would separate out the cream from the rest of the milk, which meant when we were separating milk traditionally, the milk would sort of ferment a bit and we would end up with cultured butter, whereas this meant that we ended up with fresh butter, sweet butter, as we have today. There's other chapters here all about sort of food and folklore and digital humanities. I have a chapter myself there about 72 words for potatoes, talking about Irish language sources. There's a great chapter about food, the wake of the dead and traditional hospitality. And what's interesting about that is that in the 20th century, there was, if you were bringing food to a wake or if you're having a wake, it was important to use shop bought bread, shop bought jam, shop bought butter as such. There was no respect for the homemade stuff. Whereas nowadays, like, if you brought shop bought bread, they wouldn't be too impressed. Like, you know what I mean? There's much more respect for homemade bread. So these things change from time to time. Um, there was, as part of that, like, as I said, the potato did come in around 400 years ago, and the potato gradually, it took a certain period of time to be accepted by the Irish. It went through, say, four stages. The first stage where it sort of acted as sort of a new food when there was scarcity of other food, and then the poor started getting into it, and then people became very reliant on it, and our population started to grow quite dramatically because actually where you had potatoes, you also had pigs because the pigs could eat the leftover potatoes. The pigs are the ultimate sort of dustbin. And every household, sure, like the pig was known as the gentleman who paid the rent as such, because every household would have a pig, and each pig could have maybe two or three sets of bonnows or piglets each year, and and they fatten up and they grow quickly, so you can sell them, and that's how they pay their rent and all that sort of stuff. But I love this. This is Colcannon, the little skillet pot. Oh, well, did you ever make Colcannon made with lovely pickled cream, with the greens and scallions mingled like a picture in a dream? Did you ever make a hole in top and hold a melting flake of the creamy flavoured butter that our mothers used to make? Oh, you did, so did he, and so did I, and the more I think about it, sure, the nearer I'm to cry. Oh, weren't them the happy days when troubles we had not, and our mothers made Colcannon in the little skillet pot? Well, did you ever take potato cake or boxty to the school, or tucked underneath your oxter with your books, your slate and rule? And when the teacher wasn't looking, sure a great big bite you'd take of the creamy flavoured, soft and melting sweet potato cake. Oh, you did, so did he, and so did I. And the more I think about it, sure the nearer I'm to cry. Oh, weren't them the happy days when troubles we had not, and our mothers made Colcannon in the little skillet pot? So we're coming to the end of it now. The final section is the development of modern Irish food and identity. And there's very chapters you see up on the screen. I'm conscious of the time, so I won't harbour too long on it. One of the things, Dorothy Cashman, her chapter, my co-editor on this book, her chapter is called Cookery Notes, Domestic Economy Instructresses and the History of Their Cookbooks in Ireland, because she was familiar with this book, and many of you may be familiar with this book called Cookery Notes. It's probably the best-selling cookery book ever in Ireland, because basically it appeared around 1904, and versions of it were still on sale in the 1970s in various schools. Every primary school, secondary school would have had it at various stages. Um, One of the most shocking things in all of the 28 chapters was Ian Miller's chapter, because I would have thought that hunger and starvation in modern Ireland would have stopped with the famine, whereas he has evidence in his chapter of people literally dying of hunger in West Cork in 1927, in Roscommon in the 1930s, in Dublin in the 1940s, etc., etc. Bryce Evans's chapter, he talks about food in Ireland during the years of the emergency and the 30s and 40s. And one of the really interesting thing there is that during the emergency, which is the years of the Second World War, that the Irish government basically had a legislation that said to Irish farmers that they had to till or go to jail. They allocated X amount of their land that they had to till and to grow barley or wheat or oats. And if they didn't do that, they would literally put them in jail and take the land off them. And it was a way for them to get rid of old farmers and bring in new, younger farmers and give them the land to use and be more progressive. Again, Elaine Mahon has a chapter about dining, diplomatic dining up in Áras an Uachtaráin. There's a chapter there about Máire Laverty, food writing, a chapter by Brian Murphy about eating and drinking, about basically food in Irish pubs and how it moved from the odd, packet of pub crisps to maybe a toasted sandwich up to the full, now as it is now, gastro pubs, you know what I mean? The carvery came in around 1980s. And the final chapter is the matriarch of modern Irish cooking, Myrtle Allen, 1924 to 1918, her life and legacy, because I would say that there's nobody who has done as much in the last 50 years to promote Irish food and to put it on a world map than Myrtle Allen. So that brings us to last week, where we were thrilled to win an award at the Irish Book Awards. And also, just to remind you all that the book is available for free online, open access through EUt Plus Press, and the link is in the chat. If you want to just copy it and put it into your server, you'll get direct access into the link. So I'm happy here to actually answer any questions you may have, and I'll hand it over to my co-host.
Thank you, Máirtín. That was wonderful. That was really good. So it sounds like such an immersive book, with poetry and songs and stories and spanning a huge breadth of time. So please do get a hold of the book. Like you said, there's a free copy online at the link that's given in the chat button. Or you can, you said it's out of print, Máirtín, so you won't get a hard copy yet.
No, there's some hard copies around. I think there's only around 150 copies or so left or so. So there is, you might get lucky, you know what I mean? Go and ask
Yeah.
and look for them. And you
Okay.
can go if you want one probably the best way is go straight to the Royal Irish Academy and buy from them straight away online. They'll send them out in the post. But if you definitely want one for Christmas, go book order one quickly. But as I said, there's a link there to the open access. And if you
Okay.
don't get one and you still want one, hopefully we'll have a second printing after Christmas.
Okay. There's someone looking for a link, so I'll repost it there in the chat button. I hope you can get it. It's called arrow.tudublin.ie um, /
Irish food
Irish food
Yeah,
history
yeah.
/1. Yes, it's a complicated link, so you might need to copy paste it. Any questions for Máirtín, please? We have a few more minutes so we can put them to Máirtín if you have any questions. Your colleague Jill Barrett says that no questions, but I'd like to thank him for his fantastic insights this evening and congratulate him on his publication. Really excellent.
Thanks, Jill. Again,
Um,
Jill is an old colleague of ours from Cahill Brewer Street days, and yeah.
I was looking at that final picture in your presentation, Máirtín, with the oysters, and I was wondering, in your research, did you come across things that have, things that were hard to get or more exclusive or more exciting, and that has what kind of changes did that, of course, oysters are special now and expensive, and they may
Yeah,
not
yeah,
have been that way always.
yeah.
Or the other
I,
things like that.
Yeah, oysters used to be the food of the poor or the food of everyone. Nowadays we consider oysters to be sort of the food of the elite and the fine dining, and we
Yeah,
link it with champagne and all this sort of stuff. But oysters, were very much, and it's interesting as well because so much of like shellfish nowadays and fish in general is so expensive in Ireland, and it's
yeah,
it's sort of crazy because we're an island, and yet we eat very little fish or shellfish. We eat less or just about the same amount as the Austrians, which are completely landlocked. And in some ways, the reason for that is that we'd never had to eat, after being fisher gatherers, when cattle arrived and wheat and barley and all that, we never really had to eat fish because we had such, we had the cattle, the milk, the oats, the all the nuts, everything. Like we had such a selection of food without having to actually go out into the sea to get fish. So the archaeologists now, from their analysis of bones and human bones, they figure out that the Irish diet was never more than around 5 or 6% shellfish or fish. Uh, so that it was always mostly dairy and meat and oats and barley and wheat and vegetables and that sort of stuff. So I think that's interesting. But equally, this idea about foods that move from being exclusive foods at one stage and then become the food of the poor, things like white bread, tea, sugar, you know, these things, 200 years ago, 200, 300 years ago were absolutely the exclusive. Only the rich could afford them. All the big houses, they would have had special tea caddies with locks on them where the lady would lock away the tea in case the servants would steal it. Whereas then with the Industrial Revolution and people working in cities and factories and living in tenements, that they were basically surviving nearly solely on what they call bread and spread, like tea, sugary milky tea, bread and spread, whether that spread was like treacle or marmite or jam or whatever. And what's interesting as well is, and Ian Miller has written about this a lot, in not necessarily in this book, but in other publications, is that after the famine, that the diet of the poor actually was worse when we started to eat bread and tea, when rather than when we were eating porridge and potatoes. That actually the porridge and potatoes was probably the most huge, porridge, potatoes and milk and butter, with the odd bit of herring and the odd bit of pork or bacon, was probably the most healthy diet. And there's evidence that the Irish men were so strong going into the British Army, and that the Irish women were so beautiful, that, based on this healthy diet, compared to, say, the English at the time, which were living in cities and eating poorly in their industrial cities.
Great. Thank you, Martin. Some lovely comments here. Amazing talk, says Brendan. Such a rich theme and so well presented with songs and images. Way more entertaining than the professional medieval farters you mentioned. That was brilliant. I hadn't heard of that. Great story. Thank you. Your work is wonderful. Listening from Melbourne, Australia. Would love to buy the book, says Leanne Howard. What's your favorite food, Martin? Asks Serena.
Yeah, well, that's the people often ask, like, what would be your death row meal, and I normally tell them my death row meal would probably be the meal my mother used to make every Tuesday, because a lot of people might remember that families normally had a pattern during the week what you'd make, but the Tuesday meal was mashed potatoes that had mashed carrots and parsnips mixed through it. And then it would be served normally with what we call a mixed grill, as in sausages and rashers, and if we were lucky, maybe a little bit of black pudding, or a little bit of maybe lamb's liver or something like that. You know what I mean? But just for me, this was, and plenty of butter, and for me, this was just heaven. Absolute heaven. And even to this day, it's pure comfort food for me. If I'm ever really just wanting to sort of need a big sort of food hug as such, I'll make that dish and thoroughly enjoy it.
That sounds like the poem on Colcannon, isn't it? It sounds
Yeah, it's not far from it.
great talk. Memories of early days of Cahal Brugha sent, and my sisters who went there in the 1940s. All in the cooking was our Bible, says
That's right.
Lelia Doolin.
Yeah, yeah, Amelia, what you call it, All in the Cooking was written by three women, three of the instructors, or the teachers in Brewer Street, More Murnahan, Josephine Marnell, and oh, I can't remember the third off the top of my head, but it was such a popular book. And like that, like the other one, like the Cookery Notes, these are books that you hardly ever get in a secondhand store, because they're so well used and so well loved that they're either completely worn out. As in, a really good cookbook is a cookbook that's actually splattered with sauce and grease and whatever, because you know it's been used and the pages are sticking together. Do you know what I mean? Any of these pure, beautiful cookbooks you see in a secondhand store, if there's nothing, if they're still pristine, they've never been used. You know what I mean? And the amount of people, like my mother has all in the cooking, and I will claim it, when her time comes as such. But what's lovely about those old cookbooks as well is when you open them up, quite often there's little newspaper clippings
Mm.
of where they've taken, and there was a woman who wrote about sort of Irish American food, and she had a beautiful term, the idea about cooking with scissors. And the idea was about actually cutting out with a scissor, cutting out recipes in newspapers, and then you'd put them in to the back of a book. And I know that like there was a woman called Mab Hickman who used to write for the Irish press in the 1950s, and my mother has her recipe for what you call it, Christmas pudding. And see, that's the one that we use in our house, which stems back, and because her granny gave it to her, you know what I mean? So there you go. Thanks,
And
Leela.
what would be the first ever Irish cookbook? Was it the one that you mentioned?
No, it's probably it's hard to we have there is a cookbook, but we don't even know who wrote it because it said written by a lady, all right? And it's written from I think it's around 1767. Uh, but the next one that we can sort of associate with Ireland is the Countess of Caledon in 1847, and it was written as a guide to people during the famine about how to cook without the potato as such, with other things. Uh, and but really they don't. A glut of Irish cookbooks really appear only around the 1900s and particularly after 1922 with independence. And between that 1922 and the 1940s, there's quite a few of them. And actually, all of that story is told in Dorothy's chapter about
Okay.
those instructresses. All that information is in that chapter. And equally, we have a fella called Gary Thompson at the moment who's doing a PhD on actually tracking all of those cookbooks, digitizing them, and using some sort of like AI nearly to try and analyze, can he identify what makes up an Irish recipe?
Okay.
So there's really exciting things happening at the moment in
God.
the world of food history.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it's amazing to see so many different experts having, with insights on different aspects of food history. So it's definitely a book to watch out for. And Martin, hopefully we'll have you in person in the Burren soon enough in 2025 and we can see
I look forward.
more songs.
I believe there's a great singing session there on the Friday. So I look forward to coming and adding to it. Hopefully, you know.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic. Well, we'll leave it there and have a very good night, everyone. And as always, thank you very much, Martin. Really privileged to hear you today and listen to stuff.
Slán go fóill, gur
Yeah,
maith agat.
great. Have a good night. Thanks.